Kyle Miller, the director of the Delta Culture Center. I want to welcome you and thank you so much for coming out this evening. This is going to be a brief program. I expect it to last maybe about an hour. After we go through the program, we'll even have some opportunity for comments and questions. Some of you may have been involved with Centennial during some of the initial efforts that are going to be mentioned tonight as far as getting the church restored. So you'll probably have some questions. And so this will be a really, really good time for you to ask that.
I don't normally have people cheer for me. Normally people get angry and upset and storm out. Let me say this to you. I didn't really realize I was going to be on the program, although Kyle talked to me about it, I didn't know that I was going to formally be on the program. I will say this. We were having a meeting. David Solomon convened a meeting for us to talk about doing a monument for the people who died or were killed in the Elaine massacre. That's one of the things we want to do before 2019. We are talking about doing a clock tower in downtown Helena, and in that clock tower, not clock tower, but in that tower we'll have all the names of the people who were murdered or killed down in the massacre. We want to make sure that we recognize the people who lost their lives in that. And during that meeting, Tim Good, who's with the National Park Service, came to the meeting to talk about it because we were talking about how could we set this up in a way where the tower itself will be taken care of in perpetuity. We wouldn't want to raise money, build the tower, do this monument, and then when all of us pass away from the scene, it wither away like many of our other monuments, right? And so Tim was at the meeting. And Tim came in and he said, I just drove past a church down the street. And I said, which church? I thought it might be the Baptist church on the corner. And he said, no, the big church, and he described, and it was Centennial Baptist. And at that point, that caught my attention, although I was there to talk about Elaine and the massacre. And so David saw me over there pulling Tim to the side. And I will tell you what my interest in Centennial is, and Kyle gives you part of it, but our great-grandfather, who was a former slave in St. Francis County, came down here during the war as contraband. I don't know if all of you know this, but the edict was sent out that any slave who get to Helena would be freed. Well, my great-grandfather and his mother came down here off the plantation. He set up shop here in Helena, and at some point later, he devoted his life, for the most part, to business, but then he became a Baptist minister, and he was a pastor of Centennial. But it was the original Centennial, not the one that now stands. My great-grandfather, when he left as the pastor of Centennial, there was another pastor for 1 year, and then the Reverend E.C. Morris became pastor. And once Reverend E.C. Morris, and that's who we're going to hear about tonight, once he became pastor, then he built this magnificent building. And although I said I didn't know I was on the program, I did bring my great-grandfather's book, or a copy of it. He left us a family book so that we would know about his life, and someone interviewed him and talked to him about his life. And the person who interviewed him titled the book, How I Succeeded in Business. And I just want to read to you a couple things in that book, and I'm going to keep it brief. And he says this. He says, in 1877, I was elected pastor of the Centennial Baptist Church in Helena and served that church nearly 2 years. And then he moves on and on and on. And then he says, I was succeeded in the pastorate by Reverend Simon Lott, who served a year. He was succeeded by Reverend E.C. Morris, who has borne up that responsibility through all these years and developed the Centennial into one of the greatest church organizations in the world. He was built for this church several. He has built for this church several houses of worship to be in keeping with the age and growth of the church. To finally, he has recently built a fine brick edifice, which really surpasses the demands of a city like Helena. It is one of the finest church edifices and auditoriums owned by the Negro race anywhere in this country. I cannot help but feel proud of my historic connection with a Centennial seedling that has grown to such large proportion and that wields such influence for the good as the Centennial Baptist Church. He goes on later to describe or explain, in this part of his book, he talks about Reverend E.C. Morris. And here's what he says about Reverend E.C. Morris. He says a lot about him throughout the book, but in this particular part, here's what he says. He says, I've known Reverend E.C. Morris ever since I began in business. In fact, I was quite a young man when he and his people moved to Helena. As the foregoing pages of this book will show, he and I have been together in all of the religious organized efforts of the district and of the state. It has always been a pleasure to be associated with him in our different official relations. As Dr. Morris advanced in age and influence, I endeavored to advance in the accumulation of wealth, so that I might be able to answer some of the loud appeals that he has made for home and foreign missions and for nominational education. I have followed him over Arkansas, over the United States, across the Atlantic Ocean, and over a part of the European continent. I have never had occasion to feel ashamed of any of his public efforts as a speaker, an organizer, and a leader. His speech made in London so far surpassed anything that he had done elsewhere that I confess I was just as deeply dumbfounded as those Europeans, and as that worldwide audience of the 1,000 people who heard him with such astonishment. Now, I will say this to you, that was over 100 years ago. What that tells you is that we had a person in our community some years ago who had a vision. And his vision was to build this great church. And that church, and I think Professor Dixie will tell us about the history of the church and the history of Reverend E.C. Morris. But what we know is that we had a person in this community who built a church that was one of the greatest churches both in this state and in this country. And definitely one of the greatest black churches in the country. And the question then becomes, do we want to save it? Is it worth saving? Or is this something we want to see fall? Because if you drive past the church now, what you'll find is that there are shingles missing, it's looking dilapidated, and if we don't do something very quickly, it won't be here. It'll be gone. And so the question is, what do we want to do? And so when Tim Good pulled, and raise your hand, Tim, not that he wants to be recognized, because I'm putting a lot of pressure on him, but just as he drove through this community and wondered, what is that great church, without even being asked, there are people who drive through this community all the time and ask the same question. Well, those of us who are in this room now, the question for us is, what do we do? Do we sit here and let it fall, or do we do everything we can to preserve it? I know which one I'd vote for. And with that said, I will sit down, and I don't know who's coming behind me. I guess it will be the introduction of the speaker by Thomas Jacques.
Good evening. Dr. Quinton Dixie is an associate professor of history and religious studies at Indiana-Purdue University at Fort Wayne. A native of Fort Wayne, Professor Dixie specializes in American religious history and has written on a wide range of topics, from the African American Civil Rights Movement to the history of black Baptists in the United States. Among his publications is an edited volume, The Courage of Hope, co-edited with Cornel West, as well as a companion to the PBS documentary This Far by Faith, co-authored with Juan Williams. Currently, Dr. Dixie is working on a religious biography of Harlem, exploring the ways urban spaces transform religion and vice versa. In addition, he is completing a collection of African American testimonies from the late 18th century to the present. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Quinton Dixie.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging a couple of people, one of whom is my newfound friend, Kyle Miller. Like any newfound relationship, it takes a while to get to know each other. And Kyle is getting to know a little bit about me. One of the things he's getting to learn about me is my sense of humor. About 9:30 this morning, Kyle texted me and said, "Hello, Quinton, are you on your way?" And I texted back, No. Something came up. I'm not coming. I thought it was funny. Kyle responded, and I'm getting to know Kyle, don't play. So now I know a little bit more about Kyle's sense of humor as well. Also, Kyle's getting to know a little bit about my pace, which is kind of like the post office, steady but slow. And took me a while to get my paperwork in, but thank you, Kyle, for staying on top of me, and I'm really glad that I'm here. I'd also like to acknowledge an old friend who I don't see here right now, Phyllis Reed. I met Phyllis a long time ago, back when I had a full head of hair. Here, I brought a group of students from Indiana University to see Centennial Baptist Church about 15 years ago. And that's when I first met Phyllis. Now, I'm going to do something a bit unusual for me, and Brian's already started the rumor mill. If my mother calls me and says, the Lord answer her prayer, I'm going to know it's because you call me Reverend. But I'm going to start with a text. Normally I don't do this with this type of lecture. But when I read this text, I thought of E.T. Morris. It comes from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 and 14. And for those of you who are familiar with the book of Hebrews, this particular chapter is often thought of as the faith chapter, right? It reads like a who's who of Jewish and Christian faith. From Abraham to Isaac to Noah to Moses, you name it. They name a litany of people who lived according to their faith in their God. But interesting to me, even though this passage is read quite frequently during Black History Month, it's done so because people try to connect the story and the faith of African Americans with the story of ancient people of faith. This whole chapter kind of turns on a verse that is at worst disturbing, at best troubling. And that is verse 13 and 14, the section I like the best. I don't know what that says about me, but I like this part the best. Let me read it for you. This is after the author has listed all these great people, right? This is what Jim Washington calls the aristocracy of faith. Then after doing that, he says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. So after listing all these people, the author tells us, and guess what? They died. They lived, they had faith, they didn't get what was promised. What does this have to do with E.C. Morris? Well, after the Civil War ended, Morris and his family were on the move, looking for a country of their own. Right? They were, dare I say, yeah, I'll say it, they were refugees. Refugees of a war, right? Refugees of people displaced, dislocated by the Civil War. And Morris and his family, of all places, landed in a place called Stevenson, Alabama. Now, interesting thing about migration, you all probably know something about it. People don't just willy-nilly, throw darts at a map, right? People migrate in patterns. And there are two things that scholars say kind of determine where people end up. One is family. The other is fresh opportunities. Morris and his family had no kin in Stevenson, Alabama, but Stevenson, a little tiny town, offered all sorts of fresh opportunities for African Americans. There are a number of schools for freedmen there. It, too, had once been a contraband camp. So this seemed like a good place for them to go. While there, Morris was tutored, apprenticed, if you will, as a cobbler, and later on as a preacher by a man that we'll come back to later. After his parents died, Morris said there was nothing there for someone so ambitious as he was to do. And since he had this ambition, he decided he would go to, that's right, Helena, Arkansas, the place where people go when they have ambition in the 19th century. And when you think about it, Helena at the time was quite the booming little community. In addition to being one of these contraband camps where freed slaves came to settle, Helena boasted wages that were sometimes double the wages people were making in South Carolina and Georgia for doing the same kind of work. So high wages were one of the things that attracted people to Helena. In addition to high wages, Morris was attracted because he had someone here. After his parents died, that fellow that we said tutored him not only as a cobbler but also as a minister was, lo and behold, in Helena, Arkansas, as a minister. And Morris followed him here to Helena. Now, at the time, of course, Phillips County was predominantly black. So there was a lot of opportunity for Morris to engage both in ministry and also even in business. Now, when we think about Morris and Centennial Baptist Church, we have to ask ourselves, what do these two things symbolize? What are they signifiers of? And I'd say, number one, both Morris and Centennial Baptist Church are signifiers of the possibilities associated with self-determination and collective action. They're signifiers of the possibilities associated with self-determination and collective action. Right. One of those possibilities for E.C. Morris was unity. Morris was very big, and I'm sure your grandfather, as a co-laborer in this, or your great-grandfather with him, was very much interested in unifying fragments of the African-American community. When he arrived in Helena, one of the first things he did was to unite factions within Black Baptists in the state of Arkansas. 2 state conventions, and Morris was able to merge them into one. 2 state Black Baptist newspapers. Morris was able to merge them into one. So trying to unify people in the community was something that was very much a big part of what he considered to be his vision. Also, Morris was very interested in self-help. And both his ministry as well as Centennial shows what people can do if they're allowed to really do all that they're capable of doing, to demonstrate the full range of their capabilities and possibilities. Now, self-help doesn't mean that you don't accept the help of well-meaning people. But what Morris was concerned about was self-help that allowed one to have cooperation with whites, but at the same time maintain some sense of dignity. All right. Morris kind of, how do I say this? Well, just as you said your family was a mixed household, Catholic and Baptist, Morris's household was literally mixed, right? Racially mixed. When it was time for his family to leave the plantation, he says his father and his master held each other and wept like Jonathan and David. Why? Because they were half-brothers. Morris's family had been willed to this young man who was actually the half-brother of Morris's father. Right? So his father, Morris's grandfather, had children by a slave woman, right? And he also had children by his wife. When he died, he willed his children and grandchildren by the slave woman to his son by his wife. They were well aware of that connection, and because of that, Morris's family stayed on the plantation well after the Emancipation Proclamation. Everyone else was leaving, they stayed. Why? Because they had a commitment to family, Morris argued. So he wasn't against working with whites, but he wanted to do so in such a way that it maintained a sense of black dignity. So the possibilities associated with self-determination is one thing we can learn, and out of that, unity and self-help. Secondly, Morris and Centennial, for me, represent a real hope for the future. A hope for the future. Here we are in 1876, and black people choose to name a church Centennial. Right? What's in a name, right? People ask that question of what's in a name. Well, sometimes nothing. But in this case, quite a bit. In 1876, these people decided to name this church after what? 100th anniversary of the founding of the Republic. Black people who had once been slaves marking this important occasion, the founding of the Republic. This, to me, signifies a certain kind of hope in the future. Hope that America could one day be all the things that it was supposed to be for all of its citizens. Hope in those kind of liberal ideals of brotherhood, freedom, justice, and equality. So naming that church Centennial shows a kind of hope in the future. Morris was fond of saying, and I quote, "He who does not live in the future might as well not live at all." So he was putting a lot of stock in the future, and so were the people who founded Centennial Baptist Church by choosing such a name. Frederick Douglass was one of those folks who wasn't really high on this, right? Frederick Douglass had a famous address actually critiquing African Americans celebrating the 4th of July, marking that occasion. In fact, when he was asked in the 1850s in Rochester, New York, to speak to the citizens of Rochester, he started by saying, "Do you mean to mock me, citizens, asking me to speak today? This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn." So many African Americans didn't have necessarily the same connection or the same feelings about the importance of the holiday. But certainly those people who thought about Centennial and chose to name that church in such a way that it marked for them the importance of America and the potential for them in the future of having everything that America had to offer. Third, I think this is one of the things that's most important. Both Morris and Centennial, to a large degree, represent a legacy for our posterity. And this is one of the reasons why you asked the question, should we save it? I think, yes, if it's possible. I mean, everything gets to that point where there's a point of no return where it's not worth saving. But if it's possible, I say yes. Morris was big on trying to leave something behind. And he acknowledged the fact that his parents and their generation were not able to leave anything behind to their children. And he says that it was no fault of their own. Morris exclaimed that, quote, "It was the mistakes of the fathers of this country and the prejudice which, like smoking flax, their children will not quench." That's why his parents weren't able to leave anything behind. But he was determined to try to leave something behind for the next generation. And for him, the things that he was ready and willing to leave behind were institutions. You think about all the things that happened in that building, all the people who spoke in that building, from Booker T. Washington on down. Right? In the 19th century, Centennial was the place for Black Baptists in the United States, not in Arkansas, not in the South, in the United States. Why? Because E.C. Morris was there. Back in the early 90s, I remember Ebony Magazine had a nice cover with T.J. Jemison, who at the time was the president of the National Baptist Convention, and he was standing in front of this nice new convention building that he had built, about $25 million worth of building in Nashville, Tennessee, the first headquarters for the National Baptist Convention, the article said. And I thought to myself then, well, that's not right. The first real headquarters for the National Baptist Convention was Centennial Baptist Church. Because E.C. Morris was there as its president, Centennial served as the headquarters for that organization. So a lot of institutions were built out of that church. The first conversations about the founding of Arkansas Baptist College started in Centennial Baptist Church, with Morris and others gathered at a district association talking about the need for a Baptist school run by blacks in the state of Arkansas. So it started in that building. And so there are a lot of things that are an important part of not just Arkansas history, not just the Delta history, but American history that are tied up in that facility. So a legacy for our posterity. Now, if we go back to the text and think about what the text gives us an image of, one of the first things that comes to mind to me is a relay race. Right? You've got all these important people from Abraham on down engaged in this race. But interesting thing about this aristocracy of faith, you get to run the race, but you don't get to the finish line. You assume at some point you will. You assume that victory will be yours, but you will not get to enjoy it. Morris was aware of that. He had a deep and abiding faith in his people, a faith in his God, a faith in humanity, a faith in America, that eventually African Americans would be able to get to the finish line. Building a building like Centennial Baptist Church was a part of passing that baton, of leaving a legacy, of giving something the next generation could carry forward and pass on to their children. And in the end, finally hoping that one day, as a people, African Americans would get to the finish line. I remember when I first encountered E.C. Morris. I was in seminary at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And a classmate of mine, we were talking about our backgrounds, first couple weeks of school. And I told her I grew up in a family of preachers and I was doing my best to avoid the family business. So studying religion and teaching religion was going to be the way I got out of, ever getting in a pulpit. And she says, yeah, I grew up in a family of preachers too. And she says, one guy in my family was kind of famous. I said, who was that? E.C. Morris. And I went, huh? And the more and more we talked, I asked if I could go home with her one break to visit family. And I did, and got to know family and met her aunt and uncles. And lo and behold, her aunt pulls out this old dusty diary from under the bed. Right? E.C. Morris's diary in his own handwriting, reflections on that talk he gave in London, where your relative attended with him, all sorts of little gems in there. But one of the things that jumped out at me was page after page after page, he talked about why he did what he did, and was always about the children. Not about himself, not about his own family. Right? Like so many of our leaders, they never get what they deserve financially. Right? You think about someone like Martin Luther King Jr. Right? Coretta was always complaining about him giving away all their money. And even when he won the Nobel Prize and the big chunk of money that went with it, he gave them the majority of it to SCLC. She was not happy. I don't blame her. E.C. Morris the same way. Died with the National Baptist Convention owing him money. Why? Because not only did he refuse to take a salary, he ended up giving some of his own money, personal money, to keep the organization going. So time and time again, that's what he referred to. It's about the next generation, the next generation, the next generation. So how is it that we put something together? How is it that we leave a monument? How is it that we leave a headstone, a marker for future generations to understand that something significant happened here, that something important happened here, that something they can hold their head up high about happened here, right? It gives some people a sense of dignity, of pride, of connection with the past. So much of the issues, in my opinion, I have to start with that one, in my opinion, my wife gets on me about that because I talk so definitively. In my opinion, so much of the problems that we have in our community today, I'm speaking specifically of the African American community, has to do with a disconnection from the past. Right? When you don't know your own story, when you don't know your history, it makes it very difficult to have a proper understanding of your place in the society, of your place in the world, of the possibilities for you in the future. Right? And so knowing history starts with preserving history, right? Telling those stories. Right? My church recently, my congregation recently celebrated its 100th anniversary, 99th anniversary. And in 99 years in Fort Wayne, Indiana, we have never had a pastor who wasn't from Alabama. Not Indianapolis, Alabama. A town of, second largest city in Indiana. About close to 300,000 people, about 35,000 blacks. The majority of the people there have roots in just 2 counties in Alabama. And so recently at our church, we were sitting around with a family and friends night, telling stories. And what surprised me is how few of the young people in church knew that their families were from Alabama, knew the stories of their families from Alabama. And I understand why this is. Some of the older people actually said why this was. Stories were too painful. Experiences, even though 50 years after the fact, too raw. Didn't want to talk about it. Wanted to move on. But it's important to tell those stories. It's important to pass on that history. It's important that people know, the next generation knows, what people endured on their behalf. Centennial Baptist Church, still standing today, is a testament to that endurance. Thank you.
That was absolutely amazing. Thank you, Dr. Dixie. Thank you so much for putting everything into context. Now I will ask if Phyllis, I saw Phyllis just came in fresh off the flight from Los Angeles. If you come in and just make a few comments from the E.C. Morris Foundation.
Hello. Let me catch my breath. I'm Phyllis Hammonds, and I have allergies really badly, so forgive me for my voice. And I just got off the plane, but I'm here. I want to thank each and every one of you for being present this evening. And thank you, Dr. Dixie, for accepting our invitation to come and return to our historical town. Centennial is near and dear to my heart because of the fact that I was raised up in the church, and also because my dear beloved mother, who was a history teacher by trade, taught me about the rich history of Centennial. She loved Centennial so much, and also other members loved Centennial as well. And before I go on, are there any former members of Centennial here? I can't see for the bright light. There are not any in here. However, we love Centennial so much until when we not disorganized the church, but when we decided to disband the church because of the condition of the church, and some of us went our separate ways. But the good news is now we're going to come together again to begin a new Centennial, because of the fact that, number one, we miss each other so much, but number two, because of the rich history. My mother, along with other former members of Centennial, raised monies through fried chicken and fish dinners and through other events. They raised over, initially, 30 years ago, $200,000. At that time, I lived away. And when I came back home in order to take care of my parents, I was just so amazed that they were able to raise that amount of money until it caught the eye of the former Governor Huckabee. He was simply amazed at how we were able to raise that amount of money with little money. But we were determined in the same way that the members who came together in 1876, organized the church, and then built that magnificent structure. I also, one of the things that I hope will happen if we can restore the church to its original beauty. My mother said to me when she was transitioning from this earth, she said, I won't live to see Centennial restored, but one thing that I want you to do, if I can't have my funeral in that church, drive my body by that church. And that's exactly what we did. We had a processional and took the hearse around town to her favorite places, like that big store down there in West Helena. We went there and the schools where she taught, and the final stop was at Centennial. And we gathered on the steps of Centennial and had prayer and thanked God for allowing my mother and others to have the determination to restore the church. So I'm the third generation. I'm the second generation. But we're organizing a third generation, unfortunately. I thought by now, because I know how old I am, that the church would be fully restored. We've had a lot of obstacles along the way. But there's a third generation of young people who are in their 20s and 30s who were baptized in Centennial. And they have grown up knowing the history of that beautiful structure and the legacy of Dr. Morris and Henry James Price, who collaborated with Dr. Morris to build the church. And they are going to, I'm going to be the senior advisor, and they're going to work together to continue the work. The one thing that I hope that will happen, our community has a lot of struggles in it. We are rich in history, but poor in resources. However, we, black, white, red, green, can come together via Centennial and restore it together so that the legacy of Dr. Morris, who was born a slave, traveled to Helena and did magnificent things, and the history of those other people who came after him. Cal and Judge Miller's great-grandfather was the pastor before Dr. Morris, and he was the one who encouraged the church to hire Dr. Morris as the young minister. So I'm almost, as my mother would say, I'm preaching now. I'm asking the community and those who care about the history of this town, as well as the history of this nation, to join hands with us to restore that structure so that it can live on forever. I am so amazed as I read and study about Dr. Morris, the things that he did. And he is the one gentleman who brought the community together during the Elaine riots. He was the liaison between the black and the white community. And he said, we must come together. And immediately after that, he was able to stop a lot of rioting and a lot of lynching. He was a powerful man. One last thing I want to say to you is this, and I tell this story all the time. I was working in Oklahoma City years ago, and a lady heard, who was 90 years old at that time, and that's been about 30 years ago. When she heard that I was from Helena, Arkansas, she almost jumped out of her chair. And she said, what do you know about Centennial? I said, what do I know about Centennial? That's my church. And so I was so excited that she knew about Centennial. My mother was with me, and I went upstairs in the hotel, and I said, Mama, this lady knows about Centennial. And she said, I'm going to tell you something. She said, when I was a little girl, I came to that church, and every time Dr. Morris would speak, everybody went silent. She said his voice was wonderful. He always had a message to share. And she said, my father was one of the, he was also an officer in the National Baptist Convention. And she said that they were good friends. She said, I will never forget my experiences growing up, coming to Helena, and worshiping and participate in the National Baptist Convention. So this is a rich history. It is not only our history, but it's the nation's history. And we need to band together during these troubled times in this United States of America. Centennial can be a shining star and a beacon of light for the nation. Thank you.
Okay, so at this time, thank you, Phyllis, putting all that into context. At this time, we would like to open up the floor for questions. And if anyone would like to ask questions about anything or make comments. Yes, sir. Come on, if you would, come to the microphone, please. And Phyllis, I'm going to ask you to come up because some of the questions may be questions that maybe you can answer. Could you come back up? And you can sit on the front. I'll give you a wireless microphone. Yeah, Thomas will give you his seat. Thank you.
Dr. Dixon, you mentioned the diaries that you got to see, and I was wondering your other research of Reverend Morris. Did you ever get an indication of any particular thing he was a part of that he was extremely proud of or extremely satisfied with in what he did?
Yes, sure. The question was, in doing research on Dr. Morris, is there any particular thing that he was especially proud of? One of the things that he spoke about in terms, I could say, border on pride, was his ability to bring together the various Baptist factions in Arkansas when he first got here and assumed the position of leadership. Now, here's the reason why. We're talking here post-Reconstruction, and there had been a significant number of black carpetbaggers that had come to Arkansas, black religious carpetbaggers, folks who had set up shop, were pastoring churches, were assuming leadership roles in district associations. And on the other hand, you had a faction of folks who were former slaves, who had also established organizations and were trying to vie for leadership. And there was a lot of resentment amongst these two black groups, partly because you've got these northerners who've come south to help their benighted brethren, and there was a real air of spiritual superiority from time to time, as you can imagine. And so Morris was the one that was able to actually get those two groups to merge into one state Baptist association. So that was one thing in which he was particularly proud. The other thing about which he had a lot of pride was the formation of what has become the National Baptist Publishing Board. And that came out of a controversy. There was a convention of Baptists, both white and black, northern and southern, in Indianapolis. I think the date must have been around 1890. And on the way to Indianapolis from Georgia, a black minister, E.K. Love, was pulled off the train and beaten because he was sitting in a first-class section of the train. And it caused such a controversy at the convention, the black Baptists thought that the white Baptists should say something about this. The Southern Baptists, of course, did not say anything. The Northern Baptists, not wanting to upset the Southern Baptists, chose not to say anything. And then what they decided to do was to give one publication for black Baptists in which ministers of African American descent could publish articles. The Southern Baptists objected because to do so would put blacks in a position to teach whites. We're not going to have that. And so out of that controversy, Morris and others rallied together and said, we need to form our own publishing house. And so the National Baptist Publishing Board became that entity that still to this day publishes hymnals, Sunday school literature, books of all sorts, headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. So that was the other big institution that he talked about as a legacy leaving for the next generation, because it was able to provide employment for African American young people, give them opportunities and the like.
If you would, you can just line up behind each other and we'll go ahead or sit close by. And
Yeah,
please-
Dr. Dixie. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to please address who your question is for, too.
Okay, Dr. Dixie, there's a question I want to ask you probably afterwards if you have a few minutes, but the context that I'm asking this question is in the context of urgency. We have a building on Cherry Street, apparently have collapsed. I guess it's the old age, and what I want to ask is that when we look at the Centennial building, when was the last time an inspection done on that building to see how it is holding up structurally? And if something happens and a wall falls or whatever, that whole structure could come collapsing and you have a bigger danger. When was the last time there was a structural evaluation done? Is anybody monitoring that to make sure that that building doesn't come down? And we need to move quickly to get it so that doesn't happen.
That's a very good question. I'm so glad it's not for me. I'll let Phyllis take this.
The last time, initially there was a structural study done several years ago, and it's been maybe 5 or more years since that time. The scaffolding is what's holding the church up, and we've been blessed thus far for the church structure not to collapse. But we know that time is growing nearer, and so that's why there's an urgency now to reorganize to make sure that that does not happen.
How soon can it be to get someone in there to evaluate the building?
Is Tommy here? James. We have, is he coming? He's coming. Okay. Tommy Jameson, who was the original architect when we started many years ago, will be here tomorrow. I'll be more than happy for you to talk with him. I haven't talked with him in recent years. I mean, really in recent years because of this. I've had a lot of personal issues dealing with my parents, taking care of them. However, he will be the person who will be able to answer that question. And what we're going to have to do is have another structural analysis of the structure in order to determine, its current status.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have 2 questions, if I may, for Dr. Dixie. In your opinion, would you say that his philosophy would fit more with W.B. Du Bois or with Booker T. Washington? That's the first question. And the second one, let me make my note. Doing your research, did you uncover any information about his relationship with Southland College?
2 good questions. First one, you kind of set me up there, right? So, classic debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois on a number of topics, including education, business, but particularly the role of African American elites in the community. W.E.B. Du Bois, certainly a fan of education for the sake of it, classical education. Booker T. Washington more interested in what he considered to be practical education, right? You've got people who are just, years out of slavery. Reading Latin might be nice, but it doesn't, put food on the table. We need to teach people to work with their hands, those sorts of things. Morris was definitely a Bookerite, right? Booker T. Washington actually had his own night at the National Baptist Convention. They just called it Booker T. Washington night. So you have all these preachers who come and speak, and then Booker T. Washington gets to speak as well, where he really talked about his gospel of black self-help, which included building businesses, right? And so Morris was very active in the National Negro Business League, which Booker T. Washington established. So yes, very much interested in Booker T. Washington. And we can see correspondence between them in the Washington papers. We don't find anything in papers of Du Bois. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have a relationship, but it certainly doesn't show up documented in any particular way the way Washington does. And what was the second question? I forgot. Oh, Southland. No, I haven't seen anything about his connection with Southland. Southland was Black Quaker College, correct? Yes, Society of Friends. I think established by the Indiana yearly meeting of Friends in Richmond. Black folk don't do too well sitting in silence, I guess. All right. So Southland didn't last as long as some of the others, but I haven't seen anything about his connection with that institution.
Good evening. I don't have a question, but I would like to share with Dr. Dixie this evening. I'm Vivian Holder. I'm on City Council. My aunt, too, played a part with Centennial. She was she played the pipe organ. I do have a copy a little over 41 years ago that she left behind. This is a copy of the 100th anniversary of the Centennial Baptist Church. I'll share with you.
Yeah. You want it back. Oh, look at that. See,
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that impressed me about Centennial when I first, and Helena in particular, 15 years ago when I first came here, is that more than a lot of communities I've been to, Helena does a great job of recognizing and remembering its past. But it does so in such a way that it's not stuck in the past. It remembers the past with an eye towards the future. And that's something I've always found commendable about the people I've met in and around Helena. So thank you for this piece of Helena history, which I will give back.
I'd just like to make a comment about Mrs. Whitson, who's my piano teacher. Not only was she my piano teacher, but she taught me a lot about the history, the African-American history of Phillips County. Everyone is familiar with, I'm not going to say everyone, but Richard Wright, who was the first black male who wrote about the South and his struggles in life. As a matter of fact, some of you may know that he lived here in Phillips County and in West Helena. But your aunt shared a story how her family knew their family and pinpointed to me where he lived when he lived in West Helena. And I really value that. The pipe organ is still in the church, and it was purchased in 1908 for, I think, $30,000. Can you imagine that time, $30,000? But Mrs. Whitson could play that organ, and I can hear her now. When we would have the first song we would sing would be Holy, Holy, and she would strike those chords, and we all stood. It was never the same when she could not play that organ again. That's what I grew up with, and I really value that history. Thank you.
Just in our remainder time, we'll take a few more questions. Go ahead. No, go ahead, man.
I was so intrigued when I read the Arkansas Gazette the other day and saw that the speaker was going to be here to give a presentation on Centennial. I grew up in Centennial Baptist Church. My mother and my father both were members of Centennial Baptist Church. I can even remember my first grade teacher, Mrs. Greer. But I was so intrigued until I had so many things that my mother and father had left. And to make a long story short, I put them all together. And I want to share them with especially. There are some things that I feel, and even your picture and your mother's picture.
Will you tell him who your father was?
Anthony Blakely.
I know, but tell him a story behind his life, a little bit about his life.
Well, Anthony started out at the library, and from the library he went to First Methodist Church, and he retired at the library. I got so, I don't know, he'd wake me up every Saturday morning, and like I was telling you about your father, we grew up together, and we went to Eliza Miller, and I would have to clean the benches, and I would have to help him. So Helena is really a place that I will always call home, even though I live in Pine Bluff now. Presently, I'm working with the Magnolia Cemetery because we are trying to keep that on ground. So I'm still in Helena, and I'm glad to be in Helena.
Thank you. I just want to make comments. Some of you remember Pamela Daniels Germany. That's her aunt. And they were, the one thing, I was going to tell you one quick story about the church members when I grew up. They were from all walks of life, but I must say the church was very literate. We still have our church documents that are now at the University of Arkansas, Pine Bluff, in the archival stores there at the University Museum. We have documents from 1876 when the church was formed, organized, until it closed. And the one, I always tell the story, the one thing that fascinated me as a little girl was reading the ledger that was in a pastor's study about how many folks got kicked out of the church, how many women got kicked out of church because they were pregnant, like as if anybody else in there couldn't get pregnant. But anyway, the thing that really was of interest to me was, and I tell Kyle all the time, when I would read in a Sunday school book and it said, the weather is sunny, the temperature is 85 degrees, and it gave you the person who was the secretary gave you a description of the weather that day. That was just fascinating to me. That as if they wanted us to know what was happening when they were alive in their church. My classmate, Bruce Hudson.
Professor Cal, thanks so much for bringing this to the community. I am a descendant of the Wright. My grandmother was a Wright, Richard Wright, and
Can you talk up a little bit, Bruce?
Sure. Sure. And Centennial has always been on my heart too. I was born in West Helena, raised in Chicago. But when I came back home and brought family members back with me, doctors, and we came back to our community, came back to the place that we loved. And it always troubled us to see that sore. And it was a sore because it's like a live sore. If you're living and there's something wrong, it agitates. And that's what it did. And every day it agitates. To hear his story, I've been to his site, his burial site. I'm just curious. A man with such a renowned man, founder in his religion. And to see all of those things that he worked and strived for, things that he has recognition for, to see it go into waste. To see it go into waste. It's a heartbreaker. I don't know how we will be able to live with this if our generation allows it not to move forward. So Phyllis, I just have a general question. And it's, I know that there are going to be follow-up steps. And I'd like for the community to know about it, for us to know about it. Again, Cal, thank you so much for bringing him here. We made sure they took that.
You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking, why is it an organization like the National Baptist Convention, which really is the largest organization of blacks, religious or otherwise, in the United States, why wouldn't that organization have some role in this? And when did it change? When did the shift happen? After E.C. Morris, L.K. Williams at Olivet Baptist Church in Chicago became president of the organization. And the shift in power from rule and Southern Baptists to urban and Northern Baptists started to take place. And you see a real shift in leadership positions, in tone, in character of worship, with that shift from E.C. Morris, Arkansas, to L.K. Williams, big city Chicago. And of course, after Williams, J.H. Jackson, also at Olivet, president of the convention for decades. So as I think about why people don't know, even within the convention, some of that has to do, I think, with just the way in which everything moved away from this kind of small town and southern character for the convention to more of the urban and northern big city churches were the ones that dominated after a while. Okay. I was looking in the little history you gave me, and one of the things that it mentioned there very explicitly, one of the people that is listed as pastor prior to E.C. Morris was Robert M. Caver. Caver was the fellow that Morris followed here from Alabama. So he became pastor of Centennial after the fellow who had licensed him to preach in Alabama was also once pastor of Centennial. Robert Caver, I think maybe the first pastor actually listed there. So that's important to know. And also I was sitting there thinking that your question earlier about things that Morris was proud of. And I look out in this audience, I see a nice, dare I say, interracial congregation. Morris was always interested in working across racial lines. And that was something that he was engaged in throughout his life. We're not sure if that has something to do with his family history. We've got letters between Morris and his white family in Georgia as late as 1920, right? He's still writing the descendants of the people who had owned him. Right? And by this point, Morris, who had been a delegate to several Republican national conventions, actually had some pull within the Republican Party. And so we've got letters of him writing his white family members saying, hey, if so-and-so needs a recommendation, let me know. I'll write this person. Kind of role reversal, huh? But yeah, so Morris was always interested in that kind of interracial cooperation, right? Whether it was African-American Baptists and Southern Baptists, African-American Baptists and Northern Baptists, there was always some work across racial lines.
I want to thank you again for coming out this evening. I do want to welcome you and let you know that we're going to have refreshments in the back afterwards. So I strongly encourage you to make some friends and get to know some people along the way. And as we close, and I didn't ask him to do this, but I think he does such a good job of it. I would like if Brian would just come back and close out and kind of put everything in context on where we're going or what our next steps are. Before he comes, Phyllis will say something.
I know you're not Blakely anymore, but I would love to see your notebook, your binder. I'm from the old school, see notebook, and I'm sure others would like to see it too. And we're going. Although our documents are housed at UAPB, at some point we're going to share them with the community. And I'd like to really say one thing. I am thankful to the Arkansas History Commission, who over 20 years ago helped us to organize a truckload of documents that my mother and I saved out of the church when it was falling. And the Delta Culture Center. I can't? Why don't you do that?
Well, you already know. But one of the things we're also planning too is one of our major exhibits over in our visitor center is actually developing an exhibit on Centennial, which will incorporate a lot of the artifacts going back from even the late 1800s to 1900s with that. And we anticipate that exhibit will be open sometime in late 2018. So I wanted to share that. So that being said, Brian.
I hadn't planned to close it out, but I guess I will. Some time ago, we were getting together to have the courthouse named. And I was in a meeting in D.C., and I called Senator Bozeman. For those of you who don't know, he was the one who took my name to the president to be appointed as a judge. I was also a Huckabee appointee to the State Court of Appeals. And getting back to what Professor Dixie talked about E.C. Morris being a strong Republican, my great-grandfather was too, and I think both of them went to the Republican National Convention during their time. And my great-grandfather even talks about having the opportunity to choose the next president of the United States from that convention. So I have people all the time ask me, well, how did you get an appointment from Huckabee, and how did you get an appointment from President Bush? And I say, well, I started talking to my great-granddaddy. I will say this, that we wanted to get the courthouse named. I called Senator Bozeman. He called every member of our delegation to sit down in a meeting in his office, and we talked about a number of things, including courthouse closures. We're closing a couple of federal courthouses here in the Eastern District, which is not easy, but we had to do it due to budget cuts. In that meeting, Jonah Shoemate, who is Congressman Crawford's chief of staff, heard our presentation on naming the courthouse for Jacob Trieber. And he walked up to me afterwards and he says, Brian, I think this is something we can do. He says, who can oppose this? Well, we're trying to round up the troops again. We'll see if this works. It's a little more difficult to get Centennial to be named as a national park, but as it stands right now, it's already National Historic Register, and then the next step up is, National Historic Landmark, and it's already that. So the next step would be to try to get it designated as a national park. Now, and speaking to Tim Good from the Park Service, he says, look, he can't do anything about that. But he gave us a template. The Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta is a national park. And the church in Birmingham, what is it? The 6th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham is a national landmark. And there are several Catholic churches down in Texas, I think in San Antonio, that have been named landmarks. And the federal government takes care of them, and you have tours and all those types of things. But with the churches down in Texas, they still are able to have church service. And in fact, those have worked out even better than 6th Street and Ebenezer because they're actually still alive. And the people coming to see the church, on the tours, really like knowing that people are still worshiping there. So when I called the congressman's office and I called Senator Bozeman's office, and we have representatives here from their offices, I was very upfront. This is what we want. This is where we want to go. And we are going to try to band together to make that happen. I was asked a couple days ago, well, do the people know that you're going to have to give up ownership of Centennial? Well, we've talked to Phyllis and we've talked to others. And I think at this point, I think Dr. Dixie's point is right. We've got to work together and pull ourselves together and work with everybody if we want to see Centennial stay alive. And who holds the deed doesn't matter as much, and it won't matter at all if it falls down. You know, if I have the deed to a building that's burned down, who cares? Or that's fallen down. And so that's where we're headed. And that's what we want. And so next steps are make sure we organize here, make sure we stay in contact. And everybody knows everything that's going on in D.C. right now. There are a lot of things on the agenda. And so that's not easy. It's very difficult to get designated as a national park. And it's very difficult to go to the federal government and say, we want money. I just closed 2 courthouses. And so we know it's difficult. But I can't believe that it would be more difficult to have it named a landmark than it was to build it. And so if you think about what it took, the faith it took, the effort it took to raise the money to build that building in the 1800s, I can't believe that what we're asking is more difficult. So we just have to stay together, and all of us have to work together, and we're going to have to raise money to repair the roof because if we don't do it fairly quickly, there won't be a church to work with. And so we have challenges, but I believe we'll get it done. And so that's where we're headed from here. And so for those who want to be involved, don't give me your information because I'll lose it. But talk to Phyllis, and she's organizing the group, and even Kyle is starting to organize a group, and the Delta Cultural Center is involved, and just trying to help organize things. And that's what we're going to do. And so does anybody have any questions about that, or does everybody pretty much know what we're shooting for? And make no mistake about it, the staffers from our congressional delegations offices have told me flat out that's going to be very difficult. Not because they don't want to help us, but just because the process is difficult. So we just need to stay together, like I said, and keep pushing. So anyway, there's nothing else here. Let's close out. We will go back to the room to have refreshments. Please hang around, get to know everybody. Elijah Mundy, Professor Dixie is here to answer that private question you have, and we will adjourn.